Welcome to tonight's virtual program featuring Jim Blase, author of Theodore Roosevelt's Brotherhood of America, a daily journal of the president's nationwide travels, which I have right here, which it doesn't want to be in focus because of my blurred background. To get the conversation started, let us know where you're joining from in the chat. It is a beautiful day here in Medora, North Dakota, and the energy is building as we are only 33 days out from opening to the public on July 4th, which is very exciting. We can't wait to welcome you here in just about a month. If you have any questions for Jim during tonight's broadcast, please post them in the chat. We will have a short Q&A following our presentation. A little bit about our guest. Let's see. Jim Blase is an attorney, educator, and prolific author whose works explore both legal and historical subjects. He has written approximately 100 books, articles, and professional publications, including 6 books on Theodore Roosevelt. His latest book, Theodore Roosevelt's Brotherhood of America, a daily journal of the president's nationwide travels, examines Theodore Roosevelt's extensive travels and their impact on American public life. Jim is also the creator of the acclaimed documentary, The 1904 World's Fair Reconstructed. A nationally recognized estate planning attorney, he has practiced law for more than 4 decades and has taught at both Villanova University and St. Louis University. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Jim. All right, okay, so whenever you're ready, Jim.
Okay. Thank you, Alice. I meant to ask you, by the way, earlier, what does it feel like being named after Teddy Roosevelt's oldest daughter? My wife would never let me name my son Theodore.
Yes, it is great working here with a name like Alice because lots of people know the story. And unfortunately, I did wear Alice blue on my first day of work. So that was a really fun little happenstance. All right, I'll pass it back to you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. This is probably my favorite book I've written about Theodore Roosevelt. I've written all my books about Theodore Roosevelt about his train travels, but this one is a combination, really, of all the books, all the travel he did, why he was president. I wrote one more book called, which is about his 1911 Western trip, which is called High Ideals. And on that trip, he mostly was preaching to his audiences about God and things like that. So it's a little bit different slant of a book, but that one's out there too if you want to read about when he was maybe a little bit less stressed in his speeches. I just want to give you a little background on the book because a lot of people say, what possessed you to write this book? Well, what happened was, this was 50 years ago now. I was a freshman in college, and in my first class, we were asked to write about the education of someone we admired. And the person across the table said that she was going to write about Franklin Roosevelt. And kind of to impress her, I said, well, then I'll write about Teddy Roosevelt. And I didn't even know who Theodore Roosevelt was. I mean, I knew who he was, but I had no idea the extent of him. It worked because they ended up marrying that person, and we're still married today. So we have a common interest in the Roosevelt family. What got me really interested in him, it wasn't just the paper. It was at that same time when I started law school in 1979 was when Edmund Morris wrote his famous Rise of Theodore Roosevelt book, followed 2 years later when I was a third-year law student. David McCullough wrote Mornings on Horseback, and I'm sure most people in the audience have read those books, and they're just outstanding. So you read them and you just kind of fall in love with the subject matter. So I vowed right then and there that someday I will write my own book about Theodore Roosevelt. And then it just by mere happenstance, after law school, I went to NYU, and I lived right next to Theodore Roosevelt's boyhood home. So I got even more interested in the topic and visiting his home very frequently. So a little bit more background about NYU and why I wrote the book the way I did. In one of my classes at NYU, I wrote a paper. We had to write a term paper, And my term paper was accepted by the Missouri Law Review. I live in St. Louis. And I thought I was pretty hot stuff. And I told my professor about it because I thought, well, I'll for sure get an A in this class. Well, he said, let me see the paper. And he took it home. And then the next class, he came back. And again, I was expecting him to pat me on the back. And I said, well, what'd you think about it? And he just stared at me with this really serious look. And he said, I found it very derivative. And at the time, when I was 24 years old, I didn't think much of that statement because, this is the lead article in the Missouri Law Review. But as time went on, I thought more about what he said. And I go, he's right. Why should we ever waste our time just kind of regurgitating, what's already out there? So, but the problem is that made my task of writing about Theodore Roosevelt even more difficult because who's ever going to top Edmund Morris and David McCullough? So that's kind of where I was. I really could not think of anything that could even come close. If it was going to be something different, that it was going to be come close to the quality of their work. Then what happened was in summer of 2016, if people might remember, that was the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service. And I did a tour of all the major national parks, including on the actual day of the 100th anniversary, I wanted to be at Theodore Roosevelt National Park. So I went there and I was really privileged that night of the anniversary to hear a fireside talk by Clay Jenkinson. As most of you know, is an authority on Theodore Roosevelt. And by the way, I put that video that you can find it on YouTube if you Google that fireside chat, Clay Jenkinson. It was an amazing talk. So now I'm even more interested in, doing something. But again, I had no idea what I would write about. Then here's where I got that idea. On that same trip, at the end, one of the last places we stopped at was Yosemite. And in the gift shop, there was a book by Chris Epting, who you had on last month, Alice. And it was called Teddy Roosevelt, in California, the Whistle Stop Tour That Changed America. And I looked at the book and it was a great book, but I kept thinking to myself, he talked about his train trip in California. And I kept saying to myself, well, how did he get out to California? And that's what kind of interests me. How did he get out? How did he get back? Well, obviously he had to be on a train. So what was that all about? So I started researching that. And that's when I came up with my first book, his 1903 Western trip, 14,000 miles. Interesting trip that he hit all these national parks. I think some of the interesting things about that trip, at least to me, I'm from St. Louis, and in 1904, we had the St. Louis World's Fair. Well, in 1902, Theodore Roosevelt committed to the president of the World's Fair that he would come to St. Louis on April 30th, 1903 to dedicate the World's Fair. Well, what happened, I'm going to get into in a second, but what happened is the plans got all messed up. And so he ended up going out to Yellowstone in April of 1903, and it was going to do his entire Western trip. But because of the commitment he made to the city of St. Louis, he took the train all the way back from Yellowstone to St. Louis to dedicate the fair, and then went back out west, via Colorado to the Grand Canyon and eventually to Yosemite. And to me, that right there, that tells you something about, man, remember that was probably 8 extra days of train travel, pretty much following the same pattern he already did. So I thought that was very interesting. The other thing most of you know is that Roosevelt was a fan of keeping daily journals. He had his diaries from his childhood years, but he also did journals of, like, for example, the African safari, his South America trip, River of Doubt. And I said to myself, what I don't understand is, why did he write about those trips, Africa and South America, and never wrote about this, this 14,000 mile, 9-week trip? And I wanted to get to the bottom of that, try to figure out what out. Well, what I found was a couple of things. You hear the differences. He made those trips, as everyone knows, to Africa and South America after he was president. So he was no longer on the country's dime. Well, to make these safaris, and you can imagine the safaris to either place, tremendously expensive. You have a crew of about 20 people, and they're digging out canoes for you and doing all this stuff for you. Tremendously expensive. So he struck a deal with Scribner's magazine. And basically, that was how the trips got funded. They said, if you write these daily accounts and send them back to us, we're going to publish them over a year's time each, and we will subsidize your trip. So that was one distinguishing characteristic. The other thing was a matter of time. When he was on these train trips out west and everywhere else he went to, he didn't have time to do any daily writing because he was either giving speeches or in parades or at banquets or actually doing work on the train and preparing these speeches. These were different speeches for every city he went to. On the one trip alone in 1903, he gave 282 speeches. And again, all these parades, banquets, planting trees, etc. So he didn't have time. He did write a letter to one person about summarizing the trip, but that was about it. So that was one of the things that occurred to me, in addition to the fact that, you know, those trips were already paid for. So I decided that we were coming up on the 100th anniversary of his passing, the centennial of his passing, and I decided that what I would do, my original work would be, in order to honor the centennial of the president's passing, I would write that journal for him. In other words, if he had the time, I think he would have written the journal, but he didn't have the time. So I thought it was a special way to honor him. And so I researched those, and if you look at the book, most of it comes from newspaper accounts, piecing it together, different articles from, you know, every day of the trip, I might have used 20 different newspaper articles to piece it together, because it had to be hour by hour, every hour of the day from the time he woke up till he went to bed. And one kind of a funny story about that I always tell people is that what was interesting about that was then, and all of these books, there's 5 total books that got combined, and all of them at one point, there were 2 points in each book where I got to the point where I knew he was at a banquet from noon to 3 or from 6 to 9, but I had no idea what happened at that banquet. I couldn't find anything, and that was really frustrating me. So I kept looking, couldn't find anything. So finally, I said to my wife, who's had to endure this, I said to her, I'm just going to give up and let you write, I went to this banquet. Well, then every single time, so this was twice per each of these 5 books, at the last second, I would find the article. And it was always in some obscure newspaper. I give people examples. He might have been in Los Angeles, and the article I found was in the Hannibal, Missouri News. And the reason it was there was because what happened back then, everyone already knows this, you know, the AP writers were on the train with him, and they would type everything in, and they would just send, you could just access it, and you decided yourself in your particular city what you thought was important. Well, for whatever reason, this particular obscure, smaller city newspaper thought that bank was important. So every time I was able to fill it in, and you can't believe how happy that made me. The other reason I was able to write this, I wrote the book in the first person. And the reason I was able to do that was it's the realization. I always tell people, Alice, like if you and I went on a 9-week train trip together, I can guarantee you by the end of that trip, I would know you really well. Okay. And we're just sitting side by side for 9 weeks. Well, so that what that allowed me to do then was when the AP reporter or even a local reporter said, you know, he seemed to really enjoy that, all I did was change it to I really enjoyed that, because I knew 99+% chance he did based upon what I just told you about spending so much time with a person. So that's the key that allowed me to write first personal journal, which was the way Roosevelt would have wrote it, the way he wrote African safaris and his South America trip. Okay, so that gives you a little background. And what I was most happy was that by going that unique way, I was finally able to make my NYU professor proud of me, because I didn't just, you know, copy another work. Give something new. So the idea of the book is you learn from it. You learn a lot about, because this is 5 total months of travel, which were largely unaccounted for in the history books. You learn from that, but you really get to know Roosevelt as a person. And this is what I like the most about it. You'll see when you read it, you find out, there are his speeches in there about antitrust laws, the tariff and national park, whatever. But what the unique thing about the book is you find out Roosevelt as a person. What was he really like? And I'm just telling you what I found was he was a tremendously caring person. He would, like, after every train trip, he would get out of his caboose and go walk up to the front of the train just to thank their conductor. And he would do things like that all the time. There were one time a person was, it was an outside speech, and an elderly person was passing out in the audience on a hot day. And he got up and walked down there and brought her his chair and his pitcher of water. Things like that. And he would always preach about brotherhood. That's what I noticed in all of his speeches, even though the topic was something different, might have been about antitrust law or whatever, he would weave in concepts about how we should treat each other, and not from a moral perspective. What he was talking about for the good of the country. If we want to progress as a country, we have to start by the way we treat each other. Rich versus poor, black versus white, north versus south, woman versus man, etc. And so these are the unique things. And so what I did was, my compromise approach with the editors was, I will take those main quotes from that particular part of the country, and I'll put those at the beginning of the book. So if a person wants to, they can just read all that part of the book, or if they don't care about that, they can read the rest. And the other neat thing about the book is, and this is why I made it in a coffee table book format, is that if you just page through it and look at the photos, there's like 500 photos and railroad maps from the early 1900s that you can follow along. If you just look at the photos, and I'm going to do that in a second, you'll see in here that, by the way, I'm going to mention that's a train picture of him in Hannibal, Missouri, my favorite picture of Roosevelt. And I found out about a couple months ago that I actually plagiarized this. There was a book written when I was 10 years old, okay? And it was a children's book, and it was a drawn photo at the front, but it had this exact same cover. So I actually plagiarized someone's cover, and I feel bad about that. Although I noticed there are certain things that were different. He didn't make the telegraph wire stand as high and things like that. So now a little bit about why I wrote the book and how I did it. I want to also get into what the book itself, the different parts of the country, and what struck me. And again, what could strike you would be totally different. But again, just repeating myself, every single area of the country, beginning with his very first speeches, he would always speak about brotherhood. And he also, by the way, he spoke a lot about, most of Roosevelt fans know this, he idolized mothers, and he would speak about mothers a lot, motherhood. And if you just think back, I always tell people, there were no 1903, there were no grocery stores, there were no dishwashers and washing machines. Everyone had 10 or 12 kids, and the husbands usually at the bar, the saloon, on the way home from work. So he just spoke so highly, and he said, the number one citizen in the United States are the mothers. And I just thought that was interesting. He would say that consistently, very often, okay? So anyway, themes of brotherhood, regardless of race, income. He would talk about, he used this analogy a lot. He said, when you were because at his speeches, they were people from veterans there. And he'd always refer to the veterans and said, when you were in war and fighting side by side, you could care less if that man next to you was rich or poor or north or south, whatever, you could care less. All you care about is he's going to have your back. And that's what he meant. He would use this word, I thought it was very interesting. He would use this word antecedents, and he would always tell the people, don't judge a person by their antecedents. And what I thought was interesting was, remember, there were no microphones back then and things like that. But half the time, the AP reporter would write accidents, thought he said accidents, but he meant antecedents. And basically that means don't judge a person by their cover, by their background, until you've tried to get to know them. And he would say that consistently. So I know I'm almost sounding a little emotional here, but that's why I love Roosevelt so much, is because of and remember, that's the president of the United States telling us that. He had no use for political parties or anything like that. He would always say, if what I'm doing doesn't help everyone in the country, you should vote me out of office. He had that type of an approach to it, which is kind of cool, I thought. Okay. So I mentioned about the gaps, how I selected the cover photo. What I like about it, I'm going to go back to that real quick, and I'll go on to the book, was that this photo is demonstrative of all the 5 months of train travel. He would get into a town, and if the town had a stand set up for him, he would walk over to the stand to give his presentation. Some of them were formal presentations, at banquet halls or something, but typically there was a stand set up. And then if that stand had a table, a sturdy table on it, he would stand on top of the table. So here he is here in Hannibal, Missouri, and he's standing on top of a table so everyone can see and hear him. I also like the photo because I think he looks great in it. Look at that top hat and his suit, and just a great photo of him. It's very hard to, it was very hard to capture Roosevelt from the front. And this is one was from the front. Obviously, the guy was below the table. But other interesting things about this photo, I just want to mention, look at those people down by his knees, okay? So you look at them, they're all older. They have two things in common. They're older gentlemen, and they all have big smiles on their face. What Roosevelt used to do every time he got into a city, first thing he'd do, he would call up any veterans, whether it was of the Civil War or the Spanish-American War, and all the veterans, if there was room, came up and sat next to him on that stand. Well, look at their faces, especially the guy on the left and stuff. They're going, oh my goodness, the president of the United States asked me up here to sit by him. Obviously, he shakes his hand and talks to each one of them. So I like the photo because that's what went on basically everywhere when he got off the train. And then the crowds were incredible. The crowds were incredible. And I'm going to talk about that. But look at these guys sitting on the top of that wireless telegraph pole in addition to the building. And I like it because it's Hannibal, Missouri, and I'm from St. Louis. By the way, I did go visit this exact spot years ago, and I couldn't find it, and I was just very lucky. In one of the restaurants in Hannibal, there was a gentleman giving a speech on the history of Hannibal. So I listened to his speech, and then when I got done, I asked him about this photo. I said, "Can you show me where that is?" And he said, "Well, they tore that down about 10 years ago, but let me walk you over to it." And it was just kind of neat, just standing kind of my favorite spot, of my book, and just standing there and just soaking it all in. And that's one of the neat things about the book too. If you're anywhere near some of these areas, like Chris mentioned, he was in the Santa Barbara Mission. He talked about that, and he has a photo of him there. And it's just kind of cool. This is where Roosevelt was. And so go through the photos and say, are any of these areas near me? And can I go there and just kind of soak it up a little bit? All right. So that's enough about the background of the book, but you get the goal of it. I'm going to kind of go through the actual areas and how he did this. So he started off in this was after McKinley's assassination. This is now the spring of 1902, and he made his decision. He was going to do this. He was going to visit all 48 states and territories. But the wise man that he was, well, I'm kind of new to the presidency. I can't be gone for a long time. So I'm going to do these short trips. And also, I don't want to be away from my wife and kids that long. So this is a picture of him on the Atlantic coast. This was his first trip. He travels down to Charleston for the Charleston Exposition. And that's Mrs. Roosevelt standing by him. And he also went out, he took a boat out to Fort Sumter. And he gets started here, and almost immediately he starts talking about this concept of brotherhood. I just thought it was interesting for a person right into the presidency. That's kind of what he observed, and that we needed as a country. Again, it wasn't a moral thing; it was more like for the good of the country, we have to, remember this is 40 years after the Civil War. We have to join together, and that's going to come up in a second. Here he is speaking. This is a kind of a typical scene at these train stations. So if there was not a stand, he would get on, the back of the train and talk from there. He talked at every single city, unless it was middle of the night, and sometimes he even got up in the middle of the night, to go out there and talk to people if they were yelling at him enough. So that says something about the man right there. He would not. It didn't matter if there's 5 people there or whatever. He would talk to them. It's very special. Okay. So here he is handing out diplomas. He did that first spring. He was at the Naval Academy and the Military Academy, and actually handed out the diplomas, didn't just give a speech, which is pretty cool. All right, now we're in New England. So the Atlantic coast was a series of short trips. He also went to Pittsburgh, and on the 4th of July, which is coming up. And in that speech, he talked a lot about brotherhood, which makes sense for the 4th of July and, the anniversary of the founding of our country. So he talked a lot about that. And then now he's starting his extended trips where Mrs. Roosevelt did not come with him. This was a 2-week trip in the fall, late summer and early fall of 1902, where he went to New England. And here he is, get all these photos are in the book. Here he is standing in an electric car. One of the first presidents, I assume, I don't really know the whole history of that, but one of the first presidents to drive an electric car. He would give speeches. So he's in a parade now, and he's in a carriage. And often he would give a speech. He would stop and give a talk in the middle of the parade, because, these people are lined up for 2 miles. And, the only way he could have people hear them was give a talk several times during the parade. So he would ask the person that was driving to stop, and he would give a talk. And I thought, and this is a nice photo of him from the front. Look at these crowds. What happened is, by the time he got to New England, the word was out. Remember, there's no TV or anything like that, but there are newspapers. And the word was out, that he's making these trips. And so these are all the people, and they weren't just from Providence, they're from everywhere near Rhode Island to hear him talk. And remember, he's just getting started here. Look at that crowd. It's just amazing to me. So I want to give you a feel for the size of these audiences. Here he is actually on that stand giving that speech to that crowd. And these are some really good photos. What I took was, and the book explains this, Harvard allowed me to use their collection of pictures, and they have really good pictures. And all I did was use software to sharpen the best I could, because some of them, Roosevelt's in it, but you can't really tell until you actually use it. So about half of what I did when writing the book was make the photos as good as I could, so you can see them. And these are some really neat photos of him. What you'll notice as you watch the photos, though, you actually see him aging. Remember, this was over 3.5 years, and you can actually see him aging over the period. He's in Massachusetts here, speaking in front of a library. He's again in Massachusetts. The sad part about the trip was on the very last day, and most of you again know this, he was involved, his carriage was involved in an accident where a streetcar ran into it. And his very good friend and chief Secret Service agent, William Craig, died in that accident. And Roosevelt was severely injured. And you hear different estimates of how far he was thrown, but he was severely injured. Obviously, his face was great, but he hurt his leg pretty bad, and that ended up being relevant when he was on the trip in the Amazon, as far as his infections of his leg. But he was William Craig would ride with him in these carriages in the front with the driver. And just looking, surveying everything as they went. There were other Secret Service or surgeons agents too, but that was his principal job. And, he gave his life for Roosevelt. So that affected Roosevelt deeply. William Craig was very close to his family because he would basically position himself in the White House outside his door, okay, a lot of times, and would play with the kids and stuff like that. Just more of the crowds gives you an idea. And see how Roosevelt stands. If he has some kind of a stand, he's up there. There's a table next to him with a pitcher of water. This is the typical speech he would give in New England. Again, he on the various train shops. These guys that are on the back here, most of those people are AP reporters taking notes as he spoke. This is kind of the typical. So throughout the book, I try to give you perspective of where he's traveling. So this is one of the maps in the book, shows him his route from Portland to Bangor via Waterville. Okay, so you can kind of see that. He actually also went to Augusta. But this gives you a feel for his route and the stops. And I thought that was important. Just makes it more fun, if anything. So it's designed to make it fun. Here he is now speaking in Waterville. Look at how crammed these people are. The other thing that was really interesting was he would always, you can see a lot of women up front, he would do his best to, before he started speaking, to have all the women and children come up front. And so he would wait until that happened. And he said, I'm just not going to speak till that happens. the just shows the respect he had for the children and for women. But you'll see at the very end of his 5 years of 3.5 years of travel that ends up backfiring, because you can kind of see it right here. When the crowd swelled that much, the women and children were getting crushed. You can almost see it here, right? They were getting crushed at the front. And there were a couple of speeches where he just said, if he was talking to the men, if you don't, remember, it's hard for them to hear him, but if you don't move back, and by then it was kind of too late, I'm going to leave. And he would just leave. And he would tell the reporters afterwards, it's a shame because that was going to be a great speech. I think New Orleans was one of the examples of that. There's more speeches. Again, these are just taking the wonderful Harvard photos. And by the way, there's also credit in the book for where I got a lot of the speeches, because they're hard to find. And a couple people put together all the speeches, and I would use them a lot. Not the shorter ones, but the longer speeches you can find online. It's kind of, he was always, you can see how emphatic he is. Look at those kids down to lower bottom. They go, this guy's, he's really emphatic, obviously. But yet he was a very nice man. Just trying to get his point across about brotherhood. Here's the tragic accident now in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Okay, so the streetcar is in the back there. I kind of zoomed in here so it's not in perfect focus because this picture was taken real far away. But this is right after the accident. And you can see on the left side of that photo the wheel, one of the wheels from his carriage. And here's the actual carriage damage. So he was in the left side there when it got hit, and then William Craig was in the front, and he was killed in that accident. So right after that, Roosevelt went on. He went on that day and actually gave us a couple speeches, but the focus of the speech was obviously not on what he was going to do. It was on William Craig. All right. So from here, now he goes to, believe it or not, this is like 3 or 4 days later. Okay. He continues on his planned trip to the Mid-South area. And what's so cool about this photo, this is him on what's called, it's not there anymore, but it's called the Thompson Observation Tower in Chattanooga. That General Boynton there, he was the hero of the battles there at Chattanooga. It's in the book, but he was the big hero there, and was seriously injured, but didn't stop and led his platoon in the battle. And he received the Medal of Honor, et cetera, et cetera. But that's pretty cool, the way he gave a personal tour, it's just 40 years later, a personal tour to Theodore Roosevelt of the battlefield. So he's pointing out various things there. One of my favorite photos because of that. And you know how much respect Roosevelt would have for veterans. He goes on and he's speaking in North Carolina. The one thing I would let you notice, and you'll see it more in the book, but he was obviously very sober. I mean, this is less than a week after William Craig died. So he did the trip because he committed, he had, just like when he went back to St. Louis, he committed to do this and he was going to do it. These people were counting on him, but it didn't make him smile. He just did the best he can. Anyway, I just wanted to point that out. When you look at the book, keep that in mind. Again, here's giving some more sheet. Now he's in Asheville, North Carolina. See all the people all crammed in. That's not even a big area there. It was worse. So he's done with that trip. And this is just a couple of days after he got back from the Mid-South. Now he's going to do, he's going to do his Western trip. Okay. So this is September to fall of 1902. But he's going to now do his planned Western trip. Okay. So you can even see him there kind of leaning over because it had to be hurting his leg. I don't think he's just doing that on purpose. I think he was in pain. Okay. And you can see him there, and he's now touring the Detroit River, and he's heading out west. And he's now in Noblesville, Indiana. This is, you see the women up front? See that? All the women are up front. That's because that's the way he had to have it, because otherwise they would never get up front. Okay. And very special. So, and I get a little bit emotional about it. So what happened was I'm going to go back to the slide a little bit because that's the last real photo of the trip. When he got to Indianapolis, he could go no further, and his leg was badly infected. And so they had to cancel the trip and bring him back home. They elevated his leg in the train, and he would just read books till he got home. And that was the end of that trip. So he was supposed to go out west, and it got canceled. So that's going to explain this whole St. Louis World's Fair thing. I'm going to get there kind of quickly. It's only a few more minutes, 10 minutes. He's not going out west, and this is again the 9-week trip that I spoke of at the beginning. That's why it's April to June. He's speaking at Northwestern. He spoke at a lot of colleges. I can't put them all in here. I spoke at Wisconsin. He spoke at the University of Chicago. He's in Wisconsin here speaking. He's now in St. Paul. It's kind of a good picture. That person in the front right, that's William Loeb. And William Loeb, I was telling Alice, is my idol because he's the guy that planned this trip. And we got to remember, this is 1903, and he made like 300 stops, and he had this thing planned to the minute. I mean, I don't even know how he could even figure out, how to do that, how much time to spend in every place. I thought it was amazing. That's why that photo's in here. And I have his autographed business card from the White House. It's one of my most cherished possessions. My next most cherished is I have the actual program that was handed out, the itinerary was handed out to the press before the 1903 trip. And this thing is awesome. And you might still be able to find them, somewhere on the internet, but mine is in perfect shape. So I don't want anyone to touch it. I'm not very allowed to touch it, but this is one of my favorite items at my house. So now he's in St. Paul. By the way, after I wrote that book, I retraced the entire trip, and I gave speeches at all the history museums throughout the country that the train route was on. And one of them was in St. Paul. It was one of my favorite speeches actually in there. Look at the crowds here. Again, this is St. Paul. Look at as far as you can see. Okay. I do see some women up front here, but not many. Didn't have enough guts probably. When the interesting and big thing about the book is that when he starts going out west, and went through Iowa, South Dakota, and Wisconsin, Minnesota. What I thought was interesting was once he got past Chicago, if you read the book, every single speech he gave, he talked about Medora in North Dakota. He says, I'm getting close. I'm getting closer, to my favorite place. And I just thought that was fascinating. You'll read it. He said it at least 50 times on the way out there. So this is him at the Medora Town Hall. I talked to someone there, and he said the spaces there, they can point out the space to you. There's actually a new town hall now, but right next to it is the actual grass where this was. So I'm going out there on July 4th for the dedication of the new library. I'm going to stand in that grass, just to be, because this is him, and he's way in the back there. If you look, it's kind of the second back row in the middle. This is him at the town hall where he met all his old friends. It was pretty cool, and obviously he just loved it. But a little bit surprising to me was the stop wasn't that long. I was surprised. I thought he would stay there for a couple of days, but it really was just a couple of hours. Now he's at Yellowstone. They get off at Gardner, and he was never happier, as you know, than when he was on top of a horse, and a lot of his travels. By the way, the camping trips and the hunting trips are not in this new book, but they're in my other books. My new book is just about him meeting the people, but he would always use these trips as extended vacations, and he would go on a 2-week hunting trip or this or that. So he went on a 2-week camping trip in Yellowstone. He didn't kill any animals, but that one is in one of my books, but there's other writings on. You can Google it. That was an amazing challenge to write the account of that 2-week camping trip hour by hour. And that wasn't easy, but it was a challenge, and I enjoyed doing that. So you can see how happy he is. Now he's where he wants to be. He's in Wyoming. Let me go kind of quick with it. He would always, the other thing was people would entice him off the train with chuck wagons, the smell of the chuck wagon. And every time he got off, he would get off and go down there with the people and eat with them. Isn't that amazing? I don't know if he really was concerned about safety at that point, but he would do that all the time. I don't know what the Secret Service people were doing, but that was kind of, here he is at the Grand Canyon. All I want to mention about the Grand Canyon really quickly is in my, it was amazing. I don't think William Loeb really knew, and Roosevelt knew the extent of the Grand Canyon, really what it was, because it was not a national park when Roosevelt went there. And so what happens is when he's reading he's on the train, he was always given the local newspapers, and he was reading on the train that the next day, the railroad that serviced the Grand Canyon was going to build a hotel right on the rim, south rim of the Grand Canyon. Well, and that's called the El Tovar Hotel today. If you've ever been there, you know what it is. So Roosevelt gets to the Grand Canyon, and all of you that have been to the Grand Canyon, if you go and stand where he's standing on a beautiful day, it's very difficult to even move. I mean, it's just so beautiful. Well, Roosevelt's sitting there looking at this, and then he's thinking about that hotel. And remember, the Grand Canyon was not a national park, so there was no protections for it. Okay. And he's thinking to himself, my goodness, if they can build this hotel right on the rim, what's going to happen after that? Because the train comes right up here. Everyone's going to build homes and cottages and other hotels, and the whole rim of the Grand Canyon is going to be filled with hotels. So he's a smart guy. Obviously, he went to Harvard, and first thing he did was he's smart enough to know, look, I have no power. All I can do is ask. So he begged the people to, the famous speech, leave it as it is, keep it for your children and your children's children. And then he talked to the railroad people, and he got them that day, he got them to agree to move the hotel 60 feet back from the rim. And the last time my wife and I, a few years ago, were at the Grand Canyon, I actually paced it off, and it's 60 feet. It's at the end of the El Tovar Hotel. The balcony is 60 feet from the rim. But Roosevelt the reason I'm bringing this up is that, in my opinion, this is what caused him to be the person that wanted to protect the beauty of the nature, is because of this experience and just clicking in his brain, he had to do something. I mean, I think Yosemite was important, but Yosemite, the upper part of Yosemite, was already a national park. This is what really possessed him. So he eventually, most people know the story. He gets back to D.C. and they recently passed the Antiquities Act, and the Antiquities Act allowed him to declare anything a national monument. So he talked to his people and said, "Can I declare the entire Grand Canyon a monument?" And they said, "Well, there's nothing that I know that prevents you from doing it, and regardless, it will be in the court so long, you'll have the protections you want." And most people may know this. I was never able to find out this was intentional. But within a month of Roosevelt passing on January 6, 1919, Congress declared the Grand Canyon a national park after fighting over it all those years. I personally can't believe there's not a connection. Someday I'll find that connection. Now he's going up California real quickly. He's going up California Vision. This is the old mission that Chris Epting visited. Okay. He stood right there. This is one of my favorite places. I've been here twice now. The Big Tree Grove in Santa Cruz. It's actually a state park. And here's me. This is several years ago, standing in the same spot. I feel better because I'm probably thinner now than I was then, so I'm doing something right. But this is the only big difference was I said, oops, I had the wrong hat on. That was my wife's fault. She should have got me a top hat before we took this photo. But it's kind of cool just standing there. This is a picture of his train. Why I have this in there is because when you go to the Santa Cruz Park, the railroad is right there. So you can picture yourself, at that railroad and hear the trees right next to it. We're actually in the trees. And it's just kind of a neat experience, and they run that train. Okay. He's given more speeches in San Francisco. This is downtown. This is him at Yosemite. And again, everyone is watching this knows about his 3-night camping trip with John Muir in Yosemite. This is just probably the most famous picture at the top of Glacier Point. By the way, if you've never been there, you have to go to Glacier Point. You can't go, early there. You have to go in the middle of summer to be sure the road's open. But this is another spot. It's just like Grand Canyon. It's spots very difficult to leave it. And the other neat thing when you read a book is that it shows where he camped. And so when I went there, I just went there last Memorial Day, and I'd stand in the various spots he camped. It's just fun. So now this is 1905 now. Now he's going to the Southwest. The highlight of that trip was his reunion with the Rough Riders. He's traveling through Texas here in the state capital. Now he's with these Rough Riders. And you look at all the photos in the book, and you've never seen him happier, obviously. He just loved that reunion. One of the coolest parts of the book, I think. There's a lot in there on that. I put this picture, and I took this picture a couple years ago, and it was when he was traveling in the Southwest, he traveled from the Royal Gorge area all the way down to Glenwood Springs area, and so basically from Colorado Springs to Glenwood Springs. But when he traveled there at night because that's where he was going to do his hunting trip. Well, when he got there, he found out what he missed. And so he was so upset that he wasn't able to see this beautiful scenery, if you've ever been here, that when he went back, he changed his route. He went back the same way, but we're leaving at 6 a.m. Okay, so we're not going to miss anything this time. So I retraced that trip, that he did. Here's the Arkansas River, and there's the railroad, and this was one of my favorite spots too. Okay, last trip he went down to the southeast. Parts of that was he met with Principal Booker T. Washington at Tuskegee Normal Industrial School, and there's a good picture of that. There's other pictures, and finally, just to wrap it up, the thing I want to say again was the crowds in the Southeast, like New Orleans, Atlanta, were so big that many times he had to call off the speech because the women and children up front were getting crushed. But think about that. He's from New York City, and he's down in Atlanta, in New Orleans, in cities like that, and there are more people there than in any other place where he made a speech. And he would talk about the need to reunite the country. So I called that book Reunion because that book had both the Southeast and Southwest. So the Southwest was this Rough Rider reunion. This one was a focus on both books were really focused on reuniting the country, but also it's in the book, but he also had a reunion with his mother's family down there. And that's it. Alice, Roosevelt, I'm all done.
Thank you so much, Jim. That was such a lovely presentation, and I loved being able to see this, journey through images. It's always great when you can see, as you kind of read in your presentation, like the micro expressions on someone's face, being able to kind of see how they're feeling based on the expressions that they're making. So we are now in the Q&A portion of tonight's stream. So if you have a question for Jim, please drop it in the chat and we will read some of them live. But I will take host privileges and ask one of my own first. So I'm so interested, Jim, in the fact that you have almost kind of like a dual career. You're both an attorney and a very prolific author at the same time. So I was wondering how your day job as an attorney influenced your writing and research style, or if you think it did influence it.
Well, I'm fortunate that I have my own firm and people that help me, so I can. I just wrote another book, just published it today. It's on the internet, but it's just like a hobby. I tell people how to explain it in simple terms. A lot of people use this term. This is my golf. I would love to golf, but you can't do everything. So this is my golf. Rather than golf, I love researching history. And one person, when in reviewing this Theodore Roosevelt book, he wrote in the review, he said what he liked so much about it was so different. Reading the book was so different than the way he learned history in high school. And it was just so much more fun to write. And that's why I write these books. They're all about just making history fun to read. I always tell people there's not a single word in the books I write that I wrote. That's not what I do. What I do is I do all the research for you, and then I organize it. And it's all written, it's all exact quotes from these newspapers. So even the way it's written, you may think it's written kind of weird. That's the way they talked in 1903. Okay. Even the way they spelled words, the way they capitalized words, it's all to give you a feel for you were living at that time. And that's my goal. And again, it's a good question you asked, but that really is my golf. So I don't do these other things. I'm more obsessed with these types of, it's just things that I think would interest people. And by the way, the fun is in the chase because I won't write about it unless it interests me. And it has to be something that I don't know about. For example, I would love to write a book about Theodore Roosevelt and motherhood, but I already know the story, from all this other work. And so it wouldn't be as much fun for me to write the book. It's the research part that's the fun part, and organizing it.
Yes, absolutely. And I love that kind of minute level of detail that you get down to. One of my favorite things that I learned was that there was a brief time during this period where Pittsburgh spelled the name of the city without an H.
Yeah,
I'd
I
never
had to
heard
put
that.
that in. That's a good example. I intentionally spelled it differently because that's the way they spelled it back then.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay, let's take one from the audience now. Okay, so this listener was really fascinated when you said that St. Paul's the speech of St. Paul was your favorite. So she is wondering what about the speech in St. Paul made it your favorite?
No, I misspoke. When I traveled the country, when I retraced his 1903 trip, okay, I would speak at these history museums. I think I started in Albuquerque, and I would speak at these history museums. I remember I spoke in San Luis Obispo. I remember speaking in Portland. I spoke in Montana. My favorite venue was because it was their history museum there was in a historic building. And I just really enjoyed giving it. So I misspoke. I said it was just my favorite venue to speak was that because that building was around in 1903.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And it was
Okay, so
right
we
by
have
the
another.
train station, right by the train station too.
Yes. Okay, we have another great question from the audience. If you could attend one TR speech, which one would you choose and why?
Attend one speech. I'm obviously biased. I probably would attend his speech at the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, his dedication address. I have it on the wall here in my office. That would have to be my favorite. And he talks primarily about the Louisiana Purchase. He's not really talking about the fair. He's talking about Louisiana Purchase, and I would have loved to have been at that one. But if you Google it, you'll see same thing. He's standing on top of a table. These tables must have had good balance back then. But he's standing on top of the table so everyone could see him. He would yell out as loud as he could. Fortunately, he had a pretty strong voice. But can you imagine that? You saw some of those scenes with all those people. How could they hear him? Back then. And he would just do his best as loud as he could be, and he wanted to be seen. So that would be my favorite one, but I'm biased. But I like all the speeches. I'm trying to think of this. Oh, the Grand Canyon one, obviously. I'd be crying during that one. That was to a small crowd. That was just to the people that were gathered there that day at the Grand Canyon. He gave a speech, and that whole "Leave It As It Is" speech. That's why I titled my first book, "Keep It for Your Children."
Yes, yeah, that is just so iconic, and it's so representative of what we stand for at the TRPL in trying to honor TR's conservation legacy that he so beautifully articulated in that speech. So I have another question for you. So after putting yourself in TR's shoes for the time that you researched this book and your others, even getting down to the level of like, what was it like for him to brush his teeth at night?
Yeah.
What do you think people get wrong about Theodore Roosevelt that you hope you correct with your writing?
That's a really good question. I just finished watching the Netflix, documentary on him, which was actually produced in 2022, but I think they reran it. And although I thought the acting, was really good and the storyline was really good, I don't know, just he after researching this and writing about him day by day, he just seemed like in the Netflix, I don't want to call him pompous, but he just seemed more like a know-it-all than the way he came across to me. And remember, these reporters, I don't know, they were Democrat, Republican, I have no idea, but no one ever had a bad thing to say about him. None of these reporters. All they did was compliment him. You'll see in the book, I would take a lot of these summaries. People in magazines and in newspapers, they would do summaries of his entire trip and just read those things. And so that's what I guess that impressed me most. He was just a special man. That's what I got from it. And no one, not in one single article out of that 7 years of research, did I read a single negative thing about him said.
Yeah.
And by the way, too, a lot of people, I think they misunderstand. This is not and I write about this in the book. These were not campaign trips, whistle stop trips. These were all in off election years that he would go on these things. And he would not, for example, when he was in New England, I think he was greeted by more Democrat mayors and senators than Republican, okay, would host this trip on the stand. So it wasn't, not once did I see him campaign for anybody on any of those trips. So that's kind of a misconception. I'm not saying he didn't do it, but not on these trips. not on these awful elections, because elections were different than back then. Most of us can remember the old days when even the John F. Kennedy and stuff, you didn't start running until March or April, of the election year, if then. Okay, it wasn't like these 4 years, running for office. And so when he went in his office, he did that, I think, on purpose. You didn't see him go in 1904. I think he did that on purpose because he didn't want to be tied down to that. So that's another special thing about the book. You're hearing him, that Roosevelt, the man, not the politician.
Yes. And I think that is so clear when you read the book and you see kind of him coming through the pages. I think the ordinariness of everyday life really impresses upon the reader that this is a human being, and I really appreciate that. Okay, I think we have one last question. Oh, sorry. What were you going to say?
No, I just want to mention that just getting off the train constantly to join in these truck wagons, it was amazing. And there'd be times where he would be in the bathroom in the morning and he'd hear some kids outside and he would go out there, in his pajamas. And it was just kind of so cool. He just wasn't going to disappoint anybody.
Yes. Okay, one more question from the audience.
Okay.
Have you ever visited Sagamore Hill? And if so, what was the experience like?
2 or 3 times when I was in, and one time afterwards, but 2 or 3 times when I was in NYU, I would go out there. It's if you haven't been there, it's basically just, you go from room to room and you see his guns and you see his stuffed, animals. And then the house is very pretty. It's got a huge veranda on the top of a hill, Sagamore Hill, I guess. And then what I like is when you go down there, you always hear about Roosevelt and his famous cross-country hikes, with his kids and grandkids. And so that woods is right there. And it's just really kind of neat to walk down into those woods and picture yourself doing those cross-country hikes. So it's a real special place. And, it's an interesting story. I stayed up the summer after NYU, and I was supposed to be writing a book, helping a estate planning professor write his book. And I found myself so distracted by all the Roosevelt stuff that I felt so bad about it that when the summer was over, because he paid me, the law firm rates. This is a big law firm on Wall Street. I felt so bad about it that I then worked the whole fall for free, when I got back to St. Louis, because I felt so bad that, it's just one of these things where I'm only there for a certain amount of time and I want to go. But yeah, it's a very special. His boyhood home is really neat too. You know what I'm going to do this year for the first time after the July 4th thing? I think I told you about this, Alice. I actually finally rented a 4-wheel drive, and I'm going to go out to Elkhorn. I've never been able to go there because every time I've gone to Medora, I didn't have a 4-wheel drive, and I heard you have to have a 4-wheel drive. So that's going to be kind of cool. Probably a hard time leaving there too.
Yes, and we have so much appreciation here for the folks at Sagamore Hill and at NPS in general. So I think that's our last question for tonight. So I wanted to thank you, Jim, for sharing your work with us tonight. It's just such a wonderful take on TR and really exploring who he is as a person.
You're welcome. Thank you.
If you enjoyed tonight's program, check out TR Library. Oh, yes. Thank you. Check out our other offerings at trlibrary.com or make plans to come visit us in person this summer or onward at trlibrary.com/tickets. So I hope you all have a great night, and I hope we see you really soon.
Yeah, I look forward to meeting everybody on the 4th.